Picture a sunlit garden party at Rosewood Manor, where elegant teacups hide a deadly secret. When a guest collapses, poisoned by a sip of tea, Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster of St. Mary Mead, unravels a web of greed and betrayal. Was it the poised hostess, the meticulous caterer, the gossiping neighbor, or the scheming cousin? Leonard Hartley, desperate for an inheritance. In a village where roses conceal thorns, only Miss Marple's keen observation can catch a killer before the next cup is poured. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Rosewood Manor. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where the rhythm of life followed the gentle sway of hedgerows and the chime of the church bell, the arrival of an invitation from Rosewood Manor was an event of no small consequence. The manor, perched at the edge of the village with its ivy-clad walls and sprawling gardens, was the domain of Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, a widow of refined tastes and impeccable manners. Her annual garden party was a fixture in the village calendar, a gathering where the elite of St. Mary Mead mingled with a carefully curated selection of outsiders, all under the guise of sipping tea and admiring the roses. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest cottage with its chintz curtains and well-tended garden, received her invitation on a crisp morning in early summer. The envelope, cream-colored and embossed with a delicate rose motif, bore her name in Mrs. Hartley's elegant script. Miss Marple, her silver hair neatly pinned and her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, slit open the envelope with a paper knife and read the contents with her usual quiet attention. The party was to be held on Saturday, promising an afternoon of fine teas, delicate sandwiches, and the soft strains of a string quartet. Yet, as she folded the invitation and placed it beside her knitting, a faint prickle of intuition stirred within her. Garden parties, she knew from long experience, were fertile ground for the unexpected, moments where the veneer of civility could crack, revealing the raw edges of human nature. Saturday dawned bright and warm, the sky a clear blue that set the manor's gardens ablaze with color. Miss Marple, dressed in a lavender frock and her favorite straw hat, made her way to Rosewood Manor, her sensible shoes crunching along the gravel path. The gardens were a vision. Roses in shades of crimson and blush climbed trellises, while neatly clipped hedges framed tables draped in white linen. A long table held an array of teapots, their steam curling into the air, alongside tiered stands of scones and petit fours. Mrs. Hartley, resplendent in a floral dress that mirrored her gardens, greeted each guest with a smile that was both warm and carefully measured. Among the arrivals, Miss Marple noted several figures of interest. Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, bustled about with an air of professional pride, his starched apron a testament to his meticulous nature. His reputation for flawless service was well known, and he directed his staff with the precision of a conductor. Mrs. Clara Norton, the village's most ardent gossip, hovered near the refreshment table, her eyes darting as she catalogued every interaction for later dissection. Then there was Mr. Leonard Hartley, Mrs. Hartley's distant cousin, a man in his late 30s with a lean frame and a smile that seemed to falter at the edges. His presence was curious, Miss Marple thought, given his rare visits to St. Mary Mead. As the guests mingled, Miss Marple settled beneath a willow tree, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the scene. She noted the way Mrs. Hartley's gaze lingered on Leonard, a flicker of unease in her otherwise composed demeanor. She saw, too, how Mrs. Norton whispered to a companion, her words accompanied by a pointed glance at the cousin. And she overheard a snatch of conversation between Leonard and Mr. George Langley, a jovial barrister with a booming laugh, who seemed to be teasing Leonard about family matters. Leonard's response was curt, his hand tightening briefly on his teacup. The air was thick with the scent of roses and the hum of polite conversation. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of watching the quiet dramas of village life, sensed an undercurrent of tension. She sipped her Earl Grey, its warmth a contrast to the cool shade of the willow, and let her mind wander over the possibilities. People, she reflected, were rarely as they seemed at such gatherings. Beneath the clink of china and the murmur of pleasantries, secrets waited to be uncovered, like threads waiting to be pulled from a carefully woven tapestry. Chapter 2. The Fatal Sip. The sun hung high over Rosewood Manor, casting dappled shadows across the immaculate lawns where the garden party was in full bloom. The air was alive with the soft clink of teacups, the murmur of polite conversation, and the occasional trill of laughter that floated like a breeze through the roses. Guests, dressed in their summer finery, moved gracefully between tables laden with delicate sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and an array of teas that steamed gently in their silver pots. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, the hostess, glided among her guests with the poise of a seasoned diplomat, her floral dress catching the light as she ensured every attendee felt welcomed. Yet, beneath the surface of this idyllic scene, Miss Jane Marple, seated in her shaded nook beneath the willow, sensed the subtle frissons of unease that rippled through the gathering. Her knitting needles moved rhythmically, a quiet counterpoint to the chatter, as her sharp eyes catalogued every glance, every gesture. The afternoon had reached its zenith when the tranquility was shattered by a sound that cut through the genteel hum like a knife through silk, a piercing, guttural scream. Heads turned, teacups paused mid-air, and a collective gasp rose as Mr. George Langley, the jovial barrister known for his hearty laugh and impeccable waistcoats, staggered forward from his place near the rose trellis, his ruddy face contorted in agony, his hands clawing at his throat as though an invisible noose tightened around it. His teacup, a delicate piece of porcelain adorned with forget-me-nots, slipped from his fingers and rolled into the flower bed, its contents spilling onto the earth. With a final, choking gasp, he collapsed onto the grass, his body twitching violently before falling still. For a moment, the garden seemed frozen, the guests caught in a tableau of shock. Then chaos erupted. A woman, Mrs. Clara Norton, the neighbor with a nose for scandal, shrieked and clutched her companion's arm. Another guest, a young lady in a pale blue frock, dropped her plate of cucumber sandwiches, the china shattering on the stone path. Mrs. Hartley, her composure cracking for the first time, rushed toward Langley, her voice trembling as she called his name. "George! Oh heavens, George!" she cried, kneeling beside him, her hands hovering helplessly over his still form. Miss Marple, her knitting set aside, rose quietly and moved closer, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a hawk. She noted the way Langley's lips were tinged with a faint froth, the unnatural rigidity of his limbs, and the faint, acrid scent that lingered in the air near his fallen cup. Before she could approach further, Dr. Harold Haywood, a local physician and fellow guest, pushed through the crowd, his medical bag already in hand. He knelt beside Langley, his fingers swift as they checked for a pulse, then pressed against the man's chest in a futile attempt at revival. After a moment, he sat back on his heels, his face grim. "He's gone," Dr. Haywood announced, his voice low but carrying across the hushed garden. "Dead. And from the look of it, convulsions, frothing, the speed of it all. I'd wager poison, something fast-acting, likely in the tea he drank." A murmur of horror rippled through the guests, their faces a mosaic of disbelief and fear. Poison? At a garden party? The very notion seemed an affront to the decorum of saint. Mary Mead. Mrs. Hartley, her hands pressed to her mouth, looked as though she might faint, but she steadied herself against a nearby table. "Poison?" she whispered. "But how?" The tea was prepared with care. Mr. Reed's staff handled everything. Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "My staff are professionals, Mrs. Hartley," he said sharply. "Every pot, every cup, every ingredient was under my supervision. If there's poison, it didn't come from my kitchen." His voice, usually measured, carried a defensive edge that drew curious glances from the crowd. Miss Marple, standing just outside the circle of onlookers, tilted her head slightly, her eyes lingering on Reed's clenched fists and the faint bead of sweat on his brow. She then shifted her gaze to Mrs. Clara Norton, who was whispering furiously to a cluster of women, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. Nearby, Mr. Leonard Hartley, the hostess's cousin, stood apart, his lean frame rigid, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. His expression was one of studied neutrality, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the fallen teacup, then quickly away, as though he feared it might betray a secret. The police were summoned, and within the hour, Inspector Roland Crane arrived, his tall, angular figure cutting an imposing silhouette against the fading sunlight. He was a man of method, with a clipped mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested little patience for the eccentricities of village life. His officers cordoned off the area around Langley's body, directing the guests to retreat to the manor's drawing room, where they were to await questioning. The garden, so recently a scene of elegance, now felt like a stage for a grim drama, the roses and teacups incongruous against the specter of death. Inside the drawing room, the atmosphere was stifling despite the open windows. The guests, their earlier gaiety replaced by unease, sat in clusters, their voices hushed as they speculated in low tones. Mrs. Hartley, seated on a velvet settee, clutched a handkerchief, her face pale, but her posture resolute. Mr. Reed paced near the fireplace, muttering about the damage to his reputation. Mrs. Norton, ever the opportunist, flitted from group to group, her whispers stoking the flames of suspicion. Leonard Hartley, meanwhile, leaned against a bookcase, his eyes fixed on the floor, though Miss Marple noticed his fingers twitching nervously at his sides. Inspector Crane began his inquiries with brisk efficiency, summoning each key figure to a small anteroom for questioning. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her corner with her knitting resumed, listened as the inspector's voice carried faintly through the door. She heard Mrs. Hartley's tremulous insistence that she had no enemies, that the tea was served from communal pots, and that Langley had been a dear friend of her late husband's. "He was revising some legal matters for me," she said, her voice breaking. "Nothing that could lead to this." Mr. Reed, when called, was vehement in his defense. "My staff poured the tea from the same pots for everyone," he declared. "If there was poison, it would have affected others, not just Mr. Langley. This is absurd." His indignation, Miss Marple thought, was genuine, but there was a brittleness to it, as though he feared something more than a tarnished reputation. Mrs. Norton, when her turn came, offered a litany of village gossip, hinting at tensions within the Hartley family. "That Leonard's always been a bit of a dark horse," she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "Always poking about the manor, asking about money. And George Langley, well, he knew things, didn't he? Things about wills and such." Her words, though vague, hung in the air like smoke, and Miss Marple made a mental note to explore the neighbor's penchant for half-truths. Leonard Hartley was the last to be questioned, and his responses were clipped, almost rehearsed. "I barely knew Langley," he said. "We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. I was nowhere near his tea." Yet his voice, Miss Marple observed, carried a tremor, and his eyes avoided the inspector's gaze, flickering instead toward the drawing-room door, as though he longed to escape. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the teacup itself, now in the hands of the police, but still vivid in her memory. She had seen it roll into the flower bed, its contents staining the earth, and she recalled the faint, crystalline residue clinging to its interior, a detail she had not yet shared with Inspector Crane. Poison, she knew, was a coward's weapon, requiring both opportunity and intent. The tea had been poured from communal pots, as Reed insisted, but the cups were distributed by servers, and a deft hand could easily have tampered with one. The question was who had the chance, and the motive. She rose quietly, her movements unnoticed amid the nervous chatter, and slipped into the garden where the police were still examining the scene. The flower bed where Langley's cup had fallen was cordoned off, but Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, approached an officer and inquired politely about the cup's whereabouts. "It's been taken for analysis, ma'am," the young constable replied, his tone respectful but dismissive. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the ground. There, half hidden beneath a rose bush, she spotted something the police had overlooked. A small glass vial, its label smudged but bearing traces of a chemical name. She stooped, careful not to touch it, and signaled the constable, who retrieved it with a gloved hand. Back in the drawing-room, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind working like the intricate patterns of her knitting. The vial, she suspected, held the key to the poison's origin, but its presence in the garden suggested carelessness, or perhaps a deliberate attempt to divert suspicion. She thought of Leonard Hartley, his nervous demeanor, and his proximity to the tea service earlier in the day. She recalled, too, a snatch of conversation she had overheard before the tragedy, Langley teasing Leonard about family secrets, and Leonard's curt response, his hand tightening on his cup. There was also Mrs. Hartley's fleeting look of unease when Leonard's name was mentioned, and Mrs. Norton's insinuations about his interest in the family's finances. As the afternoon faded into evening, Inspector Crane returned to the drawing-room, his face set in a frown. "The laboratory will analyze the cup and the vial," he announced. "Preliminary tests suggest aconite, a rare and deadly poison. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about." His eyes swept the room, lingering on the four key figures: Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Norton, and Leonard Hartley. Each reacted differently. Mrs. Hartley with a stifled sob, Reed with a scowl, Mrs. Norton with a sharp intake of breath, and Leonard with a stillness that seemed almost too deliberate. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, considered the dynamics at play. Aconite, she knew, was not a common household item. It required knowledge and access, perhaps from a chemist or a garden supply. She thought of the village chemist, Mr. Pritchard, and made a mental note to visit his shop. She also considered the tea service itself, how the cups were distributed, who had handled them, and whether a single cup could have been singled out. The randomness of the service, as Reed claimed, seemed plausible, but Miss Marple knew that randomness could be manipulated by a clever hand. The guests were dismissed with instructions to remain in the village, and Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, the events of the day turning over in her mind. She thought of Langley, a man whose jovial exterior had masked his role as keeper of the Hartley family's legal secrets. She thought of the codicil Mrs. Hartley had mentioned, a document that might hold the key to the motive. And she thought of Leonard Hartley, whose strained smile and restless hands suggested a man with something to hide. As she settled into her armchair, her knitting bag at her side, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of poison. It was a weapon of subtlety, requiring patience and precision, but also a certain coldness of heart. Whoever had poisoned George Langley had stood among them, smiling and sipping tea, while death waited in the wings. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as roses, Miss Marple knew that the truth would emerge, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet observation of human nature, as delicate and deadly as the aconite itself. Chapter 3. The suspects emerge. The drawing room of Rosewood Manor, with its high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, seemed to close in on the assembled guests as the reality of Mr. George Langley's death settled like a fog. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows that danced across the polished floorboards, as if mirroring the unease that flickered in every glance and whisper. The air was thick with the scent of lavender polish and the faint bitterness of cooling tea, abandoned in cups scattered across the room. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the murmurs, observed the scene with her characteristic quiet intensity. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, moved from face to face, noting the subtle tells of fear, guilt, or calculation that betrayed the polite masks of St. Mary Mead's elite. Inspector Roland Crane stood at the center of the room, his notebook open and his pencil poised, his angular frame commanding attention. His mustache twitched slightly as he surveyed the guests, his methodical mind already sorting them into categories of relevance. "We have a murder on our hands," he declared, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Mr. Langley was poisoned, and the poison was administered here, at this party. I'll need to speak with those closest to the incident, Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Norton, and Mr. Leonard Hartley. The rest of you remain here until we've taken your statements." A murmur of protest rose, quickly stifled as the inspector's gaze swept the room. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, seated on the settee, clutched her handkerchief, her knuckles white against the lace. Her face, though pale, held a resolute dignity, as if she were determined to uphold the manor's reputation even in the face of tragedy. Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, stood near the door, his arms crossed tightly, his usually composed features marred by a scowl that suggested both offense and anxiety. Mrs. Clara Norton, perched on a cushioned stool, leaned toward her neighbor, her lips moving rapidly as she spun a web of speculation. Mr. Leonard Hartley, the cousin, lingered near the bookcase, his lean figure half hidden in the shadows, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as though he could will himself invisible. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a rhythm that anchored her thoughts as she absorbed the undercurrents of the room. She had seen such gatherings before, where the veneer of civility masked darker impulses, jealousy, greed, or fear. The inspector's choice of suspects was logical, she conceded, but logic alone was not enough. Human nature, she knew, was a tangle of contradictions, and the truth often lay in the smallest details. A glance too long, a word misspoken, a gesture out of place. Inspector Crane began with Mrs. Hartley, ushering her into the anteroom with a curt nod. The door closed behind them, but the walls of Rosewood Manor were not thick enough to muffle the sound entirely. Miss Marple, her hearing as sharp as her mind, caught fragments of the conversation. "Mr. Langley was a dear friend," Mrs. Hartley said, her voice steady but strained. "He handled my late husband's affairs, legal matters, nothing more. I can't imagine who would do this. The tea was served to everyone, Inspector. It was all perfectly proper." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Proper, she thought, was a word that covered a multitude of sins. She recalled the way Mrs. Hartley had glanced at Leonard earlier in the garden, a look that held not just unease, but a trace of something deeper, distrust, perhaps, or even fear. The hostess's composure was admirable, but Miss Marple knew that composure could be a shield as much as a virtue. Next came Mr. Reed, whose indignation filled the anteroom like a storm. "My reputation is spotless, Inspector," he declared, his voice carrying clearly through the door. "I've catered for lords and ladies, and never a complaint. The tea was brewed in large pots, poured into identical cups, and distributed by my staff. If there was poison, it wasn't from my kitchen. I stake my livelihood on it." His tone was fierce, but Miss Marple noted a defensive edge, as though he feared the stain of suspicion more than the crime itself. She thought of the tea tray, so meticulously arranged, and wondered if Reed's confidence in his staff was as absolute as he claimed. Mrs. Norton's interview was a performance, her voice rising and falling with theatrical flair. "I saw nothing out of the ordinary, Inspector, but I'll tell you this. There's more to this family than meets the eye. That Leonard Hartley, always skulking about, asking questions about the estate. And Mr. Langley, he knew things, didn't he? Things about money and wills. Mark my words, there's a story there." Her words were laced with relish, and Miss Marple, listening, recognized the type. A woman who thrived on the misfortunes of others, her gossip a currency more valuable than gold. Yet there was truth in gossip. Miss Marple knew, if one knew how to sift it. Leonard Hartley was the last to be called, and his interview was brief, his responses clipped. "I barely spoke to Langley," he said, his voice low but firm. "We exchanged a few words about the weather, nothing more. I was with the other guests all afternoon. Ask anyone." His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple, watching through the half-open door, noted the way his hands twisted together, the knuckles pale with pressure. He was a man under strain, she thought, and strain often bespoke a secret. As the inspector continued his inquiries, Miss Marple's mind turned to the moments before Langley's collapse. She had been seated beneath the willow, her view unobstructed, and she recalled the sequence of events with clarity. Langley had been standing near the rose trellis, laughing with a group of guests, his teacup in hand. He had taken a sip, then another, before the first signs of distress appeared. A faltering step, a hand to his throat. The cup had fallen as he did, rolling into the flower bed, and Miss Marple had seen the faint residue inside it, a detail she had shared with no one but the constable who retrieved the cup. The vial she had found beneath the rose bush, too, was a clue that gnawed at her. Aconite, the inspector had said, and Miss Marple knew it was not a substance one stumbled upon by chance. It required intent, knowledge, and access. She thought of the suspects, each with their own place in the drama. Mrs. Hartley, the gracious hostess, had a connection to Langley through her late husband's affairs. Had there been a dispute, a secret Langley held that threatened her? Mr. Reed, so proud of his craft, had overseen the tea service, but could one of his staff have been persuaded or coerced to tamper with a cup? Mrs. Norton, with her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, seemed an unlikely poisoner, but her knowledge of the family's affairs suggested she might know more than she admitted. And Leonard Hartley, the cousin with the restless demeanor, had been near the tea tray before the party began, a fact Miss Marple had overheard from a young server named Emily, who had seemed nervous when questioned by the other guests. The drawing room grew quieter as the guests, dismissed one by one after giving their statements, began to disperse. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her knitting a pretext for remaining unobtrusive. She approached Mrs. Hartley, who was now alone on the settee, her face drawn with exhaustion. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "this must be a dreadful shock. Mr. Langley was a close friend, you said?" Mrs. Hartley nodded, her eyes glistening. "He was my husband's solicitor for years, Miss Marple. George was revising some papers for me, a codicil to the will. It was a small matter, really, but he was so thorough." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, as though the weight of her words pressed too heavily. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her mind noting the mention of the codicil. "A codicil," she said lightly, as if it were of no consequence. "Such things can be complicated, I'm sure. Did Mr. Langley discuss it with anyone else? Family, perhaps?" Mrs. Hartley's lips tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she would not answer. Then she said, "Leonard asked about it once or twice. He's always been curious about the estate. But it was nothing serious, I'm sure." Her words were careful, but Miss Marple detected a note of unease, as though the topic of Leonard was a wound she preferred not to probe. As the old lady returned to her seat, her thoughts turned to the codicil. Wills and inheritances, she knew, were fertile ground for motive. In her many years in St. Mary Mead, she had seen families torn apart by the promise of wealth, their bonds fraying under the weight of expectation. Leonard Hartley, with his strained smiles and nervous hands, seemed a man who might harbor such ambitions. But suspicion, Miss Marple reminded herself, was not evidence. She needed facts, and facts lay in the details, the vial, the teacup, the fleeting glances that spoke louder than words. The inspector emerged from the anteroom, his notebook now filled with scribbled notes. "We'll know more once the laboratory results come in," he said to the remaining guests. "Until then, I ask you all to stay in the village and report anything unusual. This was no accident." His eyes lingered on Leonard, who met his gaze with a flicker of defiance before looking away. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, her movements slow and deliberate. As she made her way to the door, she paused near Mrs. Norton, who was regaling a small group with tales of past village scandals. "Such a tragedy," Miss Marple said softly, her tone inviting confidence. "You must have seen so much today, Mrs. Norton, with your keen eye." Mrs. Norton's face lit up, eager to share. "Oh, Miss Marple, I saw plenty. That Leonard was hovering near the tea table before the party started, you know. Said he was admiring the china. But I ask you, who lingers over teacups unless they're up to something?" She lowered her voice, her eyes gleaming. "And Mr. Langley, he and Leonard had words earlier, didn't they? Something about the family. I couldn't hear it all, but it wasn't friendly." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was racing. Words between Langley and Leonard, a codicil, a vial of aconite. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though it was not yet clear. As she stepped out into the evening air, the scent of roses mingling with the cool dusk, she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle taking shape. St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet charm, was a place where secrets bloomed as readily as flowers, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like a well-tended garden, would require careful tending to uncover. Chapter 4. The Teacup's Secret. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving Rosewood Manor bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The garden, so recently a stage for elegance and tragedy, now lay quiet, its roses drooping slightly under the weight of the evening dew. Inside the manor, the drawing-room had emptied of most guests, leaving only the faint echo of their whispers and the lingering scent of tea gone cold. Miss Jane Marple, however, had not yet returned to her cottage. Her mind, as sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, was fixed on the puzzle of Mr. George Langley's death, and she knew that answers often lay in the overlooked corners of a scene. With the police preoccupied cataloging statements and securing the manor, Miss Marple slipped back into the garden, her lavender frock blending into the dusk. The cordoned-off area around the flower bed where Langley's teacup had fallen was marked by a thin ribbon, but no officers stood guard. She moved with the unhurried grace of an elderly lady, out for an evening stroll, her eyes scanning the ground with a precision that belied her mild demeanor. The teacup, she knew, had been taken for analysis, but her memory of it was vivid. The delicate porcelain, the faint crystalline residue clinging to its interior, and the way it had rolled into the earth, spilling its deadly contents. She paused near the rose trellis, her gaze settling on the flower bed. The soil was disturbed where Langley had fallen, and a few crushed petals lay scattered like confetti. Kneeling carefully, her gloved hands brushing aside a leaf, she spotted something the police had missed in their haste. A small glass vial, no larger than a thimble, half buried beneath a rosebush. Its label was smudged, but traces of printed text suggested a chemical compound, and a faint powdery residue clung to its rim. Miss Marple's lips pursed as she considered its significance. Aconite, the inspector had said, was the poison, and this vial, so carelessly discarded, might well be its source. Rising, she caught the attention of a young constable lingering near the garden gate. "Young man," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe you'll want to see this." She pointed to the vial, careful not to touch it herself. The constable, startled by her presence, hurried over, his gloved hands retrieving the tiny object with a mixture of curiosity and chagrin. "Thank you, ma'am," he muttered, clearly embarrassed that an elderly spinster had noticed what his team had overlooked. "I'll see this gets to the inspector." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite satisfaction, but her mind was already racing. The vial's presence in the garden suggested either a hasty attempt to dispose of evidence or a deliberate misdirection. She thought of the suspects, Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Norton, and Leonard Hartley, and considered who might have had the opportunity to slip such a vial into the flower bed. The tea service, she recalled, had been set up near this very spot, with servers moving to and fro. A quick hand, a moment's distraction, and the deed could have been done. Back in the drawing room, where a few stragglers remained under the watchful eye of a police sergeant, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting a comforting ritual as she pieced together the fragments of the day. Inspector Crane emerged from the anteroom, his face set in a frown as he conferred with the constable about the vial. "We'll have it analyzed," he said, his voice clipped. "If it's aconite, we're one step closer to catching our poisoner." His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on Leonard Hartley, who had returned to his post by the bookcase, his posture rigid and his gaze averted. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, considered the inspector's words. Aconite was not a common substance, requiring access to a chemist or a specialized supplier. She recalled Mrs. Norton's gossip about Leonard's visit to the village chemist, a detail that had seemed trivial at the time, but now loomed large. She also thought of the teacup's residue, which she had seen before it was whisked away. The crystalline powder, so subtle against the porcelain, suggested a poison dissolved in liquid, likely added just before the cup reached Langley's hands. The communal teapots, as Mr. Reed had insisted, made mass poisoning unlikely, but a single cup could have been tampered with during the bustle of service. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustle as Mrs. Hartley approached, her face drawn, but her manners impeccable. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "this is all so dreadful. I can't bear to think someone in my home could do such a thing." Her hands twisted the handkerchief she held, a gesture that spoke of more than grief. "My dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm with sympathy, "it's a terrible shock, I'm sure, but the truth has a way of coming out, even in the darkest moments. Mr. Langley was working on something for you, wasn't he? A legal matter, you said?" Mrs. Hartley hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the door where Leonard stood. "Yes," she said at last. "A codicil to my late husband's will. George was revising it to ensure certain provisions were clear. It was a private matter, but nothing worth killing over, surely." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the way her gaze lingered on her cousin, as though she feared what he might know. "Private matters," Miss Marple said gently, "can sometimes stir strong feelings. Was Mr. Leonard involved in these discussions?" Mrs. Hartley's lips tightened, and for a moment she seemed to weigh her words. "He asked about the estate once or twice," she admitted. "He's family, after all, and he's always been curious about such things, but I assured him it was all in hand." Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple detected a note of unease, as though the topic of Leonard was a thread she preferred not to pull. As Mrs. Hartley returned to her seat, Miss Marple's mind turned to the codicil. She had overheard enough in the village to know that the Hartley estate was substantial, with land and investments that could tempt even the most distant relative. Leonard's interest, as Mrs. Norton had hinted, seemed more than casual, and his presence near the tea tray before the party began was a detail that refused to be dismissed. She recalled, too, the young server, Emily, who had mentioned Leonard's questions about the tea blends, a seemingly innocent inquiry that now took on a darker hue. Determined to pursue this thread, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the Manor's kitchen, where Mr. Reed's staff were cleaning up under the watchful eye of a police officer. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with trays of unused sandwiches and scones stacked neatly, and the faint aroma of bergamot lingering from the teapots. Miss Marple approached Emily, a slight girl with nervous hands and downcast eyes, who was wiping down a counter. "Emily, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "You must be dreadfully shaken by all this. I couldn't help but overhear you earlier, mentioning Mr. Leonard's interest in the tea. Did he seem particularly curious about anything?" Emily glanced around, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't mean to say anything out of turn. He just asked about the blends, said he liked to know what he was drinking. I thought it odd, him being so particular, but I showed him the pots. He didn't touch anything, I swear." Her voice was earnest, but her eyes darted toward the door, as though she feared being overheard. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle reassurance. "Of course, my dear, you've done nothing wrong. It's just that small details can be so helpful in times like these." She patted Emily's arm and moved away, her mind cataloging the girl's words. Leonard's interest in the tea, coupled with his presence near the service table, suggested opportunity, but motive remained elusive. The codicil, she suspected, was the key, and she resolved to learn more about its contents. As she returned to the drawing room, she passed Mrs. Norton, who was regaling a weary-looking guest with tales of village intrigue. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Norton called, her voice bright with the promise of gossip. "You'll never guess what I heard about that Leonard. He was at the chemist's last week, buying something he wouldn't name. Shifty, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind noting the detail. "People do buy all sorts of things, Mrs. Norton," she said lightly. "But you're quite right to notice. One never knows what might matter." She moved on before Mrs. Norton could press further, but the chemist's shop was now firmly in her thoughts. Aconite, she knew, was sometimes used in minute quantities for medicinal purposes, but its lethal potential was well documented. A visit to Mr. Pritchard, the village chemist, would be her next step. The evening drew to a close, and the manor began to empty, its grandeur dimmed by the shadow of murder. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and stepped into the cool night air, the scent of roses mingling with the promise of answers. The vial, the teacup, the codicil, these were the threads of a tapestry that was still taking shape. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets bloomed as readily as flowers, Miss Marple knew that patience and observation would unravel the truth, one delicate stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Hostess's Burden. The morning after the tragedy at Rosewood Manor dawned with a heavy stillness, as though St. Mary Mead itself held its breath. The village, usually abuzz with the cheerful clatter of market stalls and the chatter of early risers, seemed subdued, its lanes quiet, save for the occasional whisper of poison and murder that drifted from doorways. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and her knitting, gazed out at her garden, where the roses nodded under a light mist. Her mind, however, was far from the tranquil scene before her. The events of the previous day, Mr. George Langley's collapse, the vial in the flower bed, the crystalline residue in the teacup, wove a complex pattern that demanded her attention. She sipped her tea, her thoughts returning to Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, the hostess whose impeccable composure had faltered only briefly under the weight of the tragedy. There was something in Mrs. Hartley's demeanor, a flicker of unease, a hesitation when speaking of her cousin Leonard, that suggested more than mere shock. Miss Marple knew that grief could mask other emotions, and she suspected that the widow of Rosewood Manor carried a burden beyond the loss of a friend. The mention of a codicil to her late husband's will, coupled with Leonard's apparent interest in the estate, hinted at a motive that could not be ignored. Determined to pursue this thread, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat and set out for Rosewood Manor. The walk was pleasant, the air crisp with the promise of autumn, but her mind was focused, sifting through the details of the garden party. She recalled Mrs. Hartley's pale face as she knelt beside Langley's body, her trembling hands as she spoke of the codicil, and the way her eyes had darted toward Leonard when his name was mentioned. These were not the actions of a woman at ease, and Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, knew that such signs often pointed to hidden truths. At the manor, she was greeted by a subdued housemaid, who led her to the morning room where Mrs. Hartley sat alone, surrounded by the remnants of the previous day's elegance. The room was bright, with tall windows overlooking the gardens, but the air felt heavy, as though the shadow of death lingered. Mrs. Hartley, dressed in a simple gray gown, rose to meet her guest, her smile faint but courteous. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft. "How kind of you to call. I'm afraid I'm not much company today." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with her knitting bag at her side. "I wouldn't dream of intruding, but I couldn't help thinking of you after yesterday's dreadful events. It must be a terrible strain, hosting such a gathering only to have it end so tragically." Mrs. Hartley's lips trembled, and she sank back into her seat, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "It's beyond comprehension," she said. "George was a dear friend, and to think someone could do such a thing, here, in my home." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a soothing rhythm that belied the sharpness of her observation. "He was your husband's solicitor, you said," she prompted gently. "Handling important matters, no doubt. It must be comforting to know his work was so thorough." Mrs. Hartley nodded, her fingers twisting a ring on her left hand. "Yes, George was meticulous. He was revising a codicil to my late husband's will, a small matter, really, but important to me. It concerned the estate's distribution, ensuring certain wishes were honored." Her words were careful, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her voice, as though the topic carried a weight she was reluctant to bear. "Such matters can be delicate," Miss Marple said, her tone light but probing. "I imagine family members might take an interest. Mr. Leonard, for instance, being a cousin, he must feel a connection to the estate." Mrs. Hartley's eyes flickered, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate. "Leonard has always been curious," she admitted. "He's asked about the estate's value, the terms of the will. I suppose it's natural, being family, but I assured him everything was in order." Her voice grew firmer, as though she were convincing herself as much as her guest. "George was finalizing the codicil to exclude certain claims, to direct funds to a charity my husband favored. It was all quite straightforward." Miss Marple nodded, her mind seizing on the word exclude. A codicil that altered inheritance could stir deep resentments, she knew, especially in a family where wealth was a tangible presence. She thought of Leonard Hartley, his nervous demeanor and his proximity to the tea tray, and wondered if the codicil had placed him at odds with Langley's intentions. "It's a comfort to have such matters settled," she said, her voice warm. "Though I suppose Mr. Langley's work must have required discretion, given the family's interest." Mrs. Hartley's lips tightened, and she rose abruptly, moving to a sideboard where a silver tray held a decanter of sherry. "Would you care for a glass, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone overly bright. "It's a small thing, but it helps steady the nerves." Miss Marple declined with a smile, noting the hostess's attempt to change the subject. "You're very kind, but I'll stick to tea, I think. Speaking of which, the tea at your party was quite lovely. Mr. Reed's staff did you proud." Mrs. Hartley's hand paused on the decanter, and she gave a small, strained laugh. "Yes, Thomas is meticulous. I've never had cause to question his service, but this poison." She shook her head as though the word itself were an intruder in her home. "I can't imagine how it happened, Miss Marple. The tea was poured from communal pots, served to everyone. How could one cup be poisoned?" "A very good question," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing for a moment. "It would require a clever hand, wouldn't it? Someone who knew exactly which cup would reach Mr. Langley." She let the words hang in the air, watching Mrs. Hartley's reaction. The hostess's face paled slightly, and her fingers tightened on the decanter, but she said nothing, returning to her seat with a glass she barely touched. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vial she had found in the garden, its smudged label and powdery residue, a silent accusation. Aconite, she knew, was not a substance one acquired by accident, and its presence suggested a plan both deliberate and ruthless. She considered the suspects. Mr. Reed, whose pride in his craft might mask a deeper involvement; Mrs. Norton, whose gossip could conceal knowledge of the crime; and Leonard, whose interest in the estate and nervous behavior marked him as a figure of interest. But Mrs. Hartley herself could not be dismissed. As the hostess, she had overseen the party's arrangements, and her connection to Langley through the codicil placed her at the heart of the drama. Seeking to probe further, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the manor's history. "Rosewood is such a beautiful home," she said, her tone admiring. "It must hold so many memories of your husband. I imagine his wishes for the estate were very dear to you." Mrs. Hartley's eyes softened, and for a moment she seemed to forget her strain. "It was his pride and joy," she said. "He built much of what you see, the gardens, the library. The will was his way of ensuring its legacy, though he always meant for some of it to go to charity. George was helping me honor that." Her voice caught, and she looked down at her hands. "Leonard thought otherwise, I'm afraid. He's always believed the estate should stay in the family." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind noting the admission. Leonard's belief in his entitlement, coupled with the codicil's intent to divert funds, painted a picture of motive that was hard to ignore. She recalled Mrs. Norton's tale of Leonard's visit to the chemist, a detail that warranted investigation, and the young server Emily's account of his questions about the tea. Each fragment was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay in the connections between them. As she prepared to take her leave, Miss Marple paused at the door, her eyes resting on a framed photograph on the mantel. a portrait of the Hartley family, taken years ago when Mrs. Hartley's husband was still alive. Leonard, younger and less guarded, stood at the edge of the group, his smile tinged with a hint of ambition. Behind the frame, barely visible, was the corner of a folded paper. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she said nothing, merely thanking Mrs. Hartley for her time and stepping into the garden. Once outside, she lingered near the library window, where the morning room's contents were just visible. The photograph, she suspected, concealed something. A letter, perhaps, or a draft of the codicil. She made a mental note to return, perhaps with the inspector's permission, to examine it further. For now, she turned her steps toward the village, her mind fixed on the chemist's shop. Mr. Pritchard, she knew, was a meticulous man, and his records might reveal whether Leonard or anyone else had acquired aconite in the days before the party. As she walked, the village waking around her, Miss Marple reflected on the burden Mrs. Hartley carried. To host a gathering only to see it marred by murder was a blow to any woman's pride, but to suspect a family member, as Mrs. Hartley seemed to, was a wound of a different kind. In St. Mary Mead, where loyalty and betrayal often walked hand in hand, Miss Marple knew that the truth would require not just evidence, but an understanding of the heart's darker corners. With her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, she moved forward, ready to unravel the next thread in the tapestry of the poisoned tea party. Chapter 6. The Caterer's Craft, the Village of St. Mary. Mead stirred slowly into life as Miss Jane Marple made her way along its cobbled lanes, her sensible shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the stones. The morning mist had lifted, revealing a sky of pale blue, but the air carried a chill that hinted at the turning season. Her destination was the kitchen of Rosewood Manor, where Mr. Thomas Reed, the caterer, and his staff were likely still grappling with the aftermath of the previous day's tragedy. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles tucked into her knitting bag, was fixed on the tea service, the delicate dance of pots, cups, and servers that had delivered death to Mr. George Langley. The caterer's vehement defense of his craft had rung true, but Miss Marple knew that truth could hide in the folds of even the most polished performance. The manor's kitchen, tucked behind the grand facade of rosewood, was a hive of ordered chaos. Copper pots gleamed on racks, and the scent of fresh-baked scones lingered, a bitter-sweet reminder of the party's promise. Mr. Reed stood at the center, directing his staff with the precision of a general, though his usual confidence was tempered by a tightness around his eyes. The police had already searched the kitchen, their heavy boots leaving faint scuffs on the tiled floor, but Miss Marple's presence, announced by a timid housemaid, drew only a curt nod from the caterer. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his hands on a pristine apron, "I'm afraid we're rather busy tidying up. The police have turned everything upside down, and I've a reputation to salvage." His tone was polite, but clipped, as though he resented the intrusion. "Of course, Mr. Reed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft as a summer breeze. "I shan't keep you long. I only wish to compliment you on yesterday's service. So beautifully done, despite the dreadful outcome. It must be quite a task, managing such an event." Reed's shoulders relaxed slightly, his pride nudged by her words. "It's my profession, Miss Marple," he said. "Every detail is planned, teas blended to perfection, cups arranged just so. My staff know their roles. There's no room for error." He gestured to the counters where trays of unused crockery were stacked, each piece gleaming as though it had never been touched. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes wandering over the kitchen. She noted the large silver teapots, now cleaned and polished, and the rows of identical porcelain cups, each adorned with the same forget-me-not pattern as the one that had fallen from Langley's hand. "Such lovely china," she said, her tone admiring. "And all the cups served from the same pots, I understand. Quite a feat to keep everything so orderly." "Indeed," Reed said, his chest puffing slightly. "The tea was brewed in those pots, Earl Grey, Darjeeling, and a chamomile blend, and poured into cups by my servers. We distribute them randomly, you see, to ensure fairness. No one could have known which cup would go to whom." His voice carried a note of defiance, as though daring her to question his system. Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her bag, began their gentle clicking, a rhythm that seemed to soothe the tension in the air. "Randomly," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "And yet, only Mr. Langley's cup was poisoned. A curious thing, isn't it? Almost as if someone had a very precise hand." She let the words hang, watching Reed's reaction. His face darkened, and he crossed his arms. "If you're suggesting one of my staff was involved, Miss Marple, I'll have you know they're all above reproach. I trained them myself. The police have questioned them, and they saw nothing amiss." His voice was firm, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes, as though he feared a crack in his carefully constructed world. She smiled, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Oh, I'm sure your staff are splendid, Mr. Reed, but in a busy service, with so many hands moving, a moment's distraction could allow something to slip through. A cup swapped, perhaps, or a substance added." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "Did you notice anyone lingering near the tea tray before the service began? Someone not part of your staff, perhaps?" Reed hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Well," he said at last, "there was Mr. Leonard Hartley, come to think of it. He was about before the guests arrived asking about the teas. Said he was particular about his blends. I thought it odd, but he's family to Mrs. Hartley, so I didn't question it." His tone suggested he now regretted that oversight. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the detail. Leonard again, she thought, her suspicions deepening. She recalled Emily, the young server, mentioning his questions about the tea, and now Reed's confirmation placed him at the scene of the crime's preparation. "How interesting," she said lightly. "And did he touch anything, do you recall?" Reed shook his head. "Not that I saw. He just looked at the pots, asked a few questions, and left. My servers handled the rest." He turned away, busying himself with a stack of trays, as though eager to end the conversation. Miss Marple thanked him and moved toward the door, but not before pausing to speak with Emily, who was polishing silverware at a side table. The girl's hands trembled slightly, and her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached. "Emily, my dear," the old lady said, her voice warm and reassuring, "you did such a fine job yesterday, despite everything. I wonder, though, if you noticed anything more about Mr. Leonard when he was near the tea tray. You mentioned he was curious about the blends." Emily's cheeks flushed, and she glanced toward Reed, who was now out of earshot. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered. "I didn't want to say too much, but he was very particular. He asked which pot was which, and I showed him. The Earl Grey was for Mr. Langley, you see, because he always liked it. Mr. Leonard seemed, I don't know, pleased. like he'd found out something important. Her voice faltered, and she busied herself with the silverware, as though afraid of saying more. Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "You've been very helpful, my dear. Don't worry yourself. It's all just to make sense of things." She stepped back, her mind racing. Leonard's knowledge of Langley's preference for Earl Grey was a critical detail, suggesting he could have targeted a specific cup. The randomness of the tea service, as Reed had claimed, was not so random after all, if someone knew which pot would supply Langley's cup. As she left the kitchen, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mechanics of the crime. The poison, aconite, had been confirmed by Inspector Crane's preliminary findings, and the vial she had found in the garden pointed to a deliberate act. But how had the poison reached Langley's cup? A server could have been bribed or coerced, but Emily's nervousness suggested fear rather than guilt. Reed's staff, by all accounts, were loyal, but loyalty could be tested by a clever manipulator. And Leonard, with his questions and his presence near the tray, was emerging as a figure whose actions demanded scrutiny. She paused in the garden, where the rose trellis stood as a silent witness to the tragedy. The flower bed, now trampled by police boots, offered no further clues, but Miss Marple's mind reconstructed the scene. The servers moving among the guests, the cups distributed with practiced ease, the moment when Langley's hand closed around the fatal cup. A sleight of hand, she thought, would have been enough. A distraction, a swapped cup, a moment when no one was looking. And Leonard, with his restless demeanor and his interest in the estate, had both the opportunity and, perhaps, the motive. Determined to follow this lead, Miss Marple made her way to the village chemist, Mr. Pritchard, whose shop was a small, cluttered haven of bottles and jars. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered, and Mr. Pritchard, a bespectacled man with a meticulous air, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "a sad business at the manor, I hear. How can I assist you?" "I'm just tying up loose ends, Mr. Pritchard," she said, her tone light. "I understand Mr. Leonard Hartley was in recently, purchasing something. I wonder if you might recall what it was." Pritchard's brow furrowed as he consulted his ledger. "Leonard Hartley, you say?" "Yes, he was here about a week ago, bought a small quantity of aconite, said it was for dealing with pests in his garden. I warned him it's dangerous stuff, but he was insistent." He shook his head as though the memory troubled him. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. "Aconite, you say? How curious. And did he mention anything else? Perhaps about the manor or Mr. Langley?" Pritchard shook his head. "Not a word. He was in and out, quick as you like. Seemed in a hurry." He paused, then added, "I hope I haven't done wrong, selling it to him. It's not uncommon for gardeners, but with this business—" "You've done nothing wrong, Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple assured him, her mind racing. Aconite for pests, she thought, was a thin excuse, especially when linked to the poison found in Langley's cup. Leonard's purchase, combined with his presence at the tea tray and his interest in the codicil, wove a damning thread through the tapestry of the crime. As she left the shop, the village clock chiming noon, Miss Marple felt the puzzle taking shape. Leonard Hartley was no longer a mere suspect, but a figure at the center of the web. Yet she knew that evidence, however compelling, was not enough without understanding the heart of the matter, the why behind the act. The codicil, she suspected, held the key, and her next step would be to uncover its details, perhaps by returning to the manor to examine the paper she had glimpsed behind the photograph. With her knitting bag swinging gently at her side, Miss Marple walked back toward Rosewood Manor, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the next layer of the poisoned tea party's mystery. Chapter 7. The Neighbor's Tale. The afternoon sun cast long golden rays over St. Mary Mead, gilding the thatched roofs and cobblestone paths with a deceptive warmth. The village, though outwardly serene, buzzed with the undercurrent of gossip that followed Mr. George Langley's shocking death at Rosewood Manor's garden party. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the light, walked with measured steps toward the village green, where she knew she would find Mrs. Clara Norton. The neighbor, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, was a fixture of saint, Mary Mead's social fabric, her penchant for tales as predictable as the seasons. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, knew that gossip, like a tangled skein of wool, often held threads of truth if one knew how to unravel it. Mrs. Norton was seated on a bench near the duck pond, her parasol propped beside her, and a small cluster of villagers gathered around, hanging on her every word. Her voice, animated and laced with relish, carried across the green as she recounted the events at the manor with a flair that bordered on theatrical. "Poison, I tell you," she was saying, her eyes gleaming. "Right there in the tea, and not a soul saw it coming. Poor Mr. Langley, clutching his throat like something out of a penny, dreadful." Her audience gasped, and she leaned forward, savoring their attention. Miss Marple approached with her usual unassuming air, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Norton," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a quiet authority. "I see you're keeping everyone informed. Such a dreadful business at the manor, isn't it?" Mrs. Norton's face lit up, delighted to have a new listener, and one as respected as Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's positively ghastly," she exclaimed, patting the bench beside her. "Sit, do sit. I was just saying how it all happened so fast. One moment Mr. Langley was laughing, the next he was gone. And to think it was poison, right under our noses." Miss Marple settled onto the bench, her needles emerging from her bag with a familiar click. "Quite shocking," she agreed, her tone encouraging. "You were there, of course, and I dare say you noticed more than most. You've always had such a keen eye for what goes on in the village." Mrs. Norton preened, her parasol twirling slightly. "Well, I do try to keep abreast of things," she said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "And let me tell you, Miss Marple, there's more to this than meets the eye. That Leonard Hartley, Mrs. Hartley's cousin, you know, he's a sly one. Always poking about the manor, asking about the estate's value, as if he's got a claim to it. I saw him myself, lingering near the tea tray before the party started, looking as though he were up to no good." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind seized on the detail. Leonard again, she thought, his presence near the tea tray confirmed by yet another witness. "How curious," she said, her voice light. "And did you see him do anything unusual? Touch the cups, perhaps, or speak with the servers?" Mrs. Norton's eyes narrowed, as though she sensed the weight of the question. "Well, I couldn't say for certain," she admitted, her tone reluctant. "He was just there, you know, hovering. But I'll tell you something else, Miss Marple. I saw him at Mr. Pritchard's chemist shop last week, buying something he wouldn't name. Kept it close, like it was a secret. I asked him what it was for, and he muttered something about gardening, but I didn't believe a word of it. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. Gardening indeed. With what happened to Mr. Langley, I'd wager it was something far more sinister. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the information. Mrs. Norton's account aligned with Mr. Pritchard's confirmation that Leonard had purchased aconite, the poison identified in Langley's cup. The neighbor's gossip, though embellished, was proving a valuable thread in the tapestry of the crime. "You do have a way of noticing things, Mrs. Norton," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "And I suppose you saw Mr. Langley himself at the party. Did he seem out of sorts, perhaps? Or did anyone speak with him in a way that caught your attention?" Mrs. Norton's face lit up, eager to share more. Oh, Mr. Langley was his usual self at first, laughing, chatting, all charm and waistcoats. But I did see him talking with Leonard near the rose trellis, just before the incident. It wasn't a friendly chat, mind you. Langley was teasing him, something about family expectations. And Leonard looked positively sour, snapped back at him, then walked off in a huff. I couldn't hear it all, but it was clear they weren't on the best of terms. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. A disagreement between Langley and Leonard, centered on family matters, suggested a deeper rift, one that might tie to the codicil Mrs. Hartley had mentioned. She recalled Mrs. Hartley's unease when speaking of her cousin and the codicil's intent to divert estate funds to a charity, potentially excluding Leonard. The pieces were aligning, but Miss Marple knew that assumptions were dangerous without evidence. "How very observant of you," she said, her voice encouraging. "And did anyone else seem particularly attentive to Mr. Langley? Mrs. Hartley, perhaps, or Mr. Reed?" Mrs. Norton shook her head, her lips pursing. Mrs. Hartley was busy playing hostess, flitting about like a butterfly. She spoke to Langley, of course, but nothing out of the ordinary. As for Mr. Reed, he was all business, fussing over his trays and servers. Though I will say that young server, Emily, is it? She looked nervous as a cat when Leonard was near the tea tray, kept glancing at him like she was afraid he'd break something. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. Emily's nervousness, noted by both Reed and now Mrs. Norton, suggested she had seen something significant, perhaps more than she had admitted. "Poor girl," Miss Marple said lightly. "It must have been a trying day for her. You've been most helpful, Mrs. Norton. It's a comfort to know someone keeps such a careful watch on the village." Mrs. Norton beamed, but Miss Marple was already planning her next move. The chemist's shop beckoned, and she excused herself with a polite smile, leaving Mrs. Norton to her audience. The walk to Mr. Pritchard's was short, the village streets quiet, save for the occasional clatter of a cart or the chirp of sparrows. The chemist's shop, with its dark wood counter and shelves lined with bottles, was a familiar haven, and Mr. Pritchard greeted her with a nod, his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Miss Marple," he said, "twice in 1 week. Quite an honor. I suppose you're here about the business at the manor. Dreadful. Simply dreadful." "Indeed, Mr. Pritchard," Miss Marple replied, her tone grave but gentle. "I was hoping you might clarify something for me. Mrs. Norton mentioned seeing Mr. Leonard Hartley here recently, purchasing something for his garden. You confirmed he bought aconite, I believe?" Pritchard's face grew somber, and he nodded, flipping open his ledger. "Yes, that's right. A small quantity of aconite for garden pests," he said. "I warned him it's potent, lethal in the wrong hands, but he was quite insistent. Signed for it, as is proper. He slid the ledger toward her, pointing to Leonard's signature, dated a week before the party. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the entry, noting the precise amount. Enough for a garden, perhaps, but also enough for a more sinister purpose. "And did he say anything else?" she asked. "Anything about the manor, or Mr. Langley, perhaps?" Pritchard shook his head. Not a word. He was brisk, almost curt. Paid and left without much chatter, which isn't like him. He's usually more talkative. His tone suggested he found Leonard's behavior odd, and Miss Marple filed the observation away. Thanking him, she stepped back into the sunlight, her mind weaving together the strands of evidence. Leonard's purchase of aconite, his presence near the tea tray, his disagreement with Langley, and his interest in the estate formed a compelling pattern. But Miss Marple knew that patterns could deceive. Mrs. Norton's tale, while useful, was colored by her love of drama, and Emily's nervousness might stem from fear rather than knowledge of guilt. The codicil remained a critical piece, and Miss Marple resolved to return to Rosewood Manor to examine the paper she had glimpsed behind the photograph. As she walked back toward her cottage, the village green now quiet as Mrs. Norton's audience dispersed, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of gossip. Like a river, it could carry truth or mud, and it was her task to sift through the silt for the glint of gold. Leonard Hartley was emerging as a figure of suspicion, but she would need more than whispers and coincidence to prove his guilt. With her knitting bag at her side and her mind as sharp as ever, she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle nearing its resolution, knowing that in St. Mary Mead the truth was never far from the surface, waiting for a patient hand to uncover it. Chapter 8. The Relative's Secret. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands. The village of St. Mary Mead was settling into its evening quiet, the clamor of gossip subdued by the weight of the day's revelations. Yet Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. Turning over the threads of evidence that wove through the tragedy at Rosewood Manor, the vial of aconite, the teacups residue, Mrs. Norton's tales, and Leonard Hartley's curious behavior, formed a pattern that was both compelling and incomplete. The codicil to the Hartley estate, mentioned by Mrs. Hartley with such unease, loomed as the key to unlocking the motive behind Mr. George Langley's murder, and Miss Marple knew that her next step must be to confront the man at the heart of her suspicions, Leonard Hartley. She set aside her knitting and donned her coat, her destination the small guest cottage on the manor's grounds where Leonard was staying. The evening air was cool, scented with the last blooms of summer, and the path to Rosewood Manor was lined with hedgerows that whispered in the breeze. As she walked, Miss Marple reflected on Leonard's demeanor, the nervous twitch of his hands, the way his eyes avoided scrutiny, the strained smile that never reached his eyes. He was a man under pressure, she thought, and pressure often betrayed secrets that composure concealed. The guest cottage, a charming structure tucked behind a copse of elms, glowed softly with lamplight. Miss Marple knocked gently, and after a moment Leonard opened the door, his lean frame silhouetted against the warm interior. His face, usually guarded, betrayed a flicker of surprise at seeing her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but wary. "What brings you here at this hour?" "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mr. Hartley," she replied, her tone as gentle as a summer rain. "I was passing by and thought I might have a word. Such a dreadful business at the party, and I know you must be as eager as anyone to see it resolved." Leonard hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The cottage's sitting room was modest but tidy, with a small fire crackling in the hearth and a stack of books on a side table. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, and fixed Leonard with a look that was both kind and piercing. "It's a terrible thing, losing Mr. Langley so suddenly," she began. "He was a friend of the family, I understand, and handling important matters for Mrs. Hartley." Leonard nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yes, he was my cousin's solicitor. A good man, by all accounts. I barely knew him, though." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his fingers, as though they longed to betray him. "Indeed," she said, her needles clicking softly. "And yet, you spoke with him at the party, didn't you? I believe someone mentioned a conversation near the rose trellis. Something about family matters, perhaps." Her tone was light, almost conversational, but her eyes never left his face. Leonard's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to weigh his response. "It was nothing," he said at last. "Just a passing remark. He made some jest about the family, and I didn't care for it. That's all." His words were clipped, and he shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the fire. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Family matters can be so delicate," she said. "I understand Mrs. Hartley was revising a codicil to her late husband's will. It must be a comfort to know the estate is in such careful hands, though I imagine you, as a relative, take an interest in such things." Leonard's face paled slightly, and he leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't meddle in Evelyn's affairs, Miss Marple. The estate is hers to manage. I only asked a few questions. Natural curiosity. You know, being part of the family." His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair, as though anchoring himself against her probing. "Of course," she said, her voice soothing. "Though I did hear you were quite particular about the tea at the party. Asking about the blends, I believe, and lingering near the service table. Such an interesting detail, don't you think, given what happened to poor Mr. Langley?" Leonard's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed caught off guard. I was just making conversation," he stammered. "I like to know what I'm drinking. There's nothing more to it." He rose abruptly, moving to the fireplace as though to tend the flames, but Miss Marple saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands shook as he reached for the poker. She let the silence stretch, her needles a quiet counterpoint to the crackling fire. "And the aconite," she said at last, her voice soft but deliberate. "I understand you purchased some from Mr. Pritchard's shop, for gardening purposes. A curious choice, wouldn't you say, given its other uses?" Leonard froze, the poker clattering against the hearth. He turned to face her, his expression a mix of defiance and fear. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" he demanded. "I bought it for pests, nothing more. The police know about it. I've done nothing wrong." His voice rose, but there was a crack in it, a note of desperation that Miss Marple recognized all too well. "I'm sure you haven't," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "But it's a small village, Mr. Hartley, and people notice things, like your visit to the chemist, or your interest in the tea, or your conversation with Mr. Langley. Small things, perhaps, but they do add up." She paused, her eyes meeting his. If there's anything you'd like to share, now might be the time. The truth has a way of coming out, you know." Leonard's face contorted, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might confess. But he drew himself up, his voice cold. "I've nothing to say, Miss Marple. I didn't touch Langley's tea, and I didn't poison him. If you're looking for a culprit, you'd do better to ask Evelyn about her precious codicil. She's the one with secrets." He turned away, his back to her, signaling the end of the conversation. Miss Marple rose, gathering her knitting with a serene smile. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hartley," she said. "I'll let you get back to your evening. Do take care." She stepped out into the cool night, her mind alight with the exchange. Leonard's deflection to Mrs. Hartley was telling, but his agitation and his mention of the codicil only deepened her suspicions. He was a man on edge, and men on edge, she knew, often made mistakes. Her next destination was Rosewood Manor itself, where she hoped to examine the paper she had glimpsed behind the photograph in the morning room. The manor was quiet as she approached, its windows glowing softly against the darkening sky. Mrs. Hartley, informed of her visit by the housemaid, welcomed her with a weary smile. "Miss Marple," she said, "you're tireless. I suppose you're still thinking about poor George." "I am," Miss Marple replied, settling into the morning room once more. "And about your codicil, Mrs. Hartley. I couldn't help but notice a photograph on the mantel yesterday, with a paper tucked behind it. Might it be related to Mr. Langley's work?" Mrs. Hartley's face paled, and she moved to the mantel, her hands trembling slightly as she retrieved the photograph. Behind it was a folded sheet, its edges worn. "It's just a draft," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "George was reviewing it. It names a charity as the primary beneficiary, excluding certain family claims. I didn't want it known until it was finalized." She handed the paper to Miss Marple, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. Miss Marple unfolded the document, her eyes scanning the neat script. It confirmed what Mrs. Hartley had said. The codicil redirected a significant portion of the Hartley estate to a children's charity, explicitly excluding Leonard Hartley, who had been named in an earlier draft. The implications were clear. Leonard stood to lose a substantial inheritance, a motive that aligned chillingly with his purchase of aconite and his presence near the tea tray. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said, returning the paper. "This is most helpful. I'm sure the inspector will want to see it." She rose, her mind racing. Leonard's secret was no longer just a suspicion, but a tangible thread, woven through the evidence of the vial, the tea, and now the codicil. Yet she knew that confrontation alone was not enough. She needed proof that would hold under scrutiny. As she left the manor, the stars beginning to prick the sky, Miss Marple felt the puzzle nearing its resolution. Leonard Hartley's secret was out, but the final piece, how he had poisoned the tea, remained elusive. She resolved to speak with Emily again, the server whose nervousness suggested she had seen more than she admitted. With her knitting bag at her side and her mind as sharp as ever, Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, ready to weave the final threads of the poisoned tea party's mystery into a coherent whole. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a gentle glow, its light filtering through the mist that clung to the village's hedgerows and rooftops. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea cooling beside a half-finished slice of toast, her knitting needles idle for once, as her mind worked through the intricate web of the poisoned tea party. The codicil, Leonard Hartley's purchase of aconite, his presence near the tea tray, and his tense exchange with Mr. George Langley formed a damning pattern, yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion alone would not suffice. To catch a murderer, one needed proof, irrefutable, undeniable proof, and she was determined to secure it. Her thoughts turned to the mechanics of the crime. The aconite, delivered in Langley's teacup, required a precise hand, a moment of opportunity amidst the bustle of the garden party. The young server, Emily, had provided a critical clue. Leonard's interest in the tea blends, specifically the Earl Grey favored by Langley. This suggested he had targeted a specific cup, but how had he ensured it reached his victim? The randomness of the tea service, as Mr. Reed had insisted, was a barrier. Yet Miss Marple's experience told her that randomness could be manipulated by a clever mind. She needed to test Leonard's guilt, to draw him out in a way that would expose his actions beyond doubt. An idea began to form, delicate but daring, inspired by the quiet dramas of village life. Miss Marple recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a culprit had been caught by recreating the scene of their crime, their nerves betraying them under pressure. A second tea party, she decided, would serve as the perfect stage. By replicating the conditions of the original event, she could observe Leonard's behavior, perhaps even provoke a mistake. She would need Inspector Crane's cooperation and Mrs. Hartley's consent, but Miss Marple was confident her plan would bear fruit. She donned her coat and hat, her knitting bag a familiar companion, and set out for Rosewood Manor. The village was stirring, its residents casting curious glances her way, their whispers of the murder a soft undercurrent to the morning's calm. At the manor, Mrs. Hartley received her in the morning room, her face drawn, but her manners as impeccable as ever. "Miss Marple," she said, rising from her chair, "you've been so kind to take an interest. I'm afraid I'm still reeling from it all." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm with sympathy, "it's a dreadful burden you carry, but I've been thinking, and I believe we might help the inspector by holding a small gathering, a memorial tea, perhaps, to honor Mr. Langley. It would allow us to observe the guests, to see if anything unusual comes to light." Mrs. Hartley's eyes widened, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Another tea party? So soon after?" Her voice trailed off, but she straightened, her resolve returning. "If you think it would help, Miss Marple, I'll arrange it. Though I confess, the thought of more tea makes my stomach turn." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You're very brave, my dear. I'll speak with Inspector Crane to ensure it's all properly managed. We'll keep it simple, just a few key guests, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Norton, Mr. Leonard, and a few others. The same tea service, if possible, to set everyone at ease." Mrs. Hartley nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she agreed. Miss Marple left the manor and made her way to the police station, a modest building near the village green, where Inspector Crane was poring over reports. He looked up as she entered, his mustache twitching with a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, setting aside his papers, "I suppose you've some new theory to share. We're still waiting on the full laboratory results, but the vial you found was indeed aconite, matching the poison in Langley's cup." "That's most helpful, Inspector," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her knitting. "I've a suggestion, if I may. A second tea party at Rosewood Manor, a memorial for Mr. Langley. It would allow us to observe the suspects in a setting like the original, perhaps prompting someone to reveal more than they intend. I'd ask your permission to involve young Emily, the server, to watch Mr. Leonard Hartley closely." Crane's brow furrowed, but he leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "A trap, you mean? It's unconventional, but I've heard of your methods, Miss Marple. If Mrs. Hartley agrees and we keep it tightly controlled, I'll allow it. But I'll have officers present and no risks taken." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Of course, Inspector. I'll ensure Emily knows what to look for, any unusual behavior from Mr. Leonard, especially near the tea tray. She's a sharp girl, despite her nerves." The plan was set, and by the following afternoon, Rosewood Manor's garden was prepared for the memorial tea. The setting was simpler than the original party, with a single table adorned with white linen, a silver teapot of Earl Grey, and a tray of the same forget-me-not patterned cups. The guest list was small: Mrs. Hartley, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Norton, Leonard Hartley, and a handful of villagers to maintain the pretense of a memorial. Inspector Crane and two plain-clothes officers mingled discreetly, their eyes sharp for any sign of trouble. Miss Marple arrived early, her lavender frock blending with the soft hues of the garden. She found Emily near the tea table, her hands fidgeting as she arranged the cups. "Now, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "you're to serve as you did before, but keep a close eye on Mr. Leonard. If he approaches the tray or does anything out of the ordinary, let me know. You needn't be afraid. The inspector's men are watching." Emily nodded, her eyes wide but determined. "I'll do my best, Miss Marple," she whispered. "I saw him near the tray last time, and it made me uneasy. I'll watch him like a hawk." The guests began to arrive, their faces a mix of solemnity and curiosity. Mrs. Hartley, pale but composed, greeted each with a nod, her role as hostess a shield against her grief. Mr. Reed supervised the tea service with his usual precision, though his glances toward the tray were wary. Mrs. Norton, her parasol twirling, whispered to anyone who would listen, her eyes darting toward Leonard with undisguised suspicion. Leonard himself arrived last, his lean frame tense, his smile strained as he took a seat near the edge of the gathering. Miss Marple settled beneath the same willow tree, her knitting a quiet presence as she observed the scene. The tea was poured, the cups distributed, and the guests sipped cautiously, their eyes flickering toward the table where Langley's fate had been sealed. Leonard, she noted, was restless, his hands moving from his pockets to his lap, his gaze shifting between the tray and the guests. She caught Emily's eye, giving her a subtle nod to stay vigilant. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple watched Leonard closely. He rose once, ostensibly to admire the roses, but his path took him near the tea tray, where Emily was refilling cups. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she saw him pause, his hand dipping into his pocket as though to retrieve something. Before he could act, Emily, following Miss Marple's instructions, accidentally bumped into him, her tray clattering as a small packet fell from his pocket to the grass. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir," Emily exclaimed, her voice loud enough to draw attention. The packet, a small paper envelope, lay stark against the green, and Miss Marple saw Leonard's face pale as he stooped to retrieve it. Before he could, Inspector Crane, alerted by the commotion, stepped forward, his gloved hand scooping up the packet. He opened it carefully, revealing a fine white powder that glinted in the sunlight. "Mr. Hartley," Crane said, his voice sharp. Care to explain this? Leonard's composure shattered, his eyes wild as he stammered. It's nothing, just a gardening remedy. You've no right. His voice broke, and the guests gasped, their murmurs rising like a tide. Miss Marple rose, her knitting set aside, and approached the inspector. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I believe that powder will match the aconite found in Mr. Langley's cup. Mr. Hartley's interest in the tea blends, his purchase of aconite from Mr. Pritchard, and his presence near the tray all point to a deliberate act." Leonard's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, silence hung heavy in the garden. Then, with a cry, he bolted toward the gate, only to be intercepted by Crane's officers. The trap had worked, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction as she watched the scene unfold. The truth, she knew, was a patient hunter, and Leonard Hartley had walked into its snare. Chapter 10. The Confession. The garden of Rosewood Manor, bathed in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun, stood in stark contrast to the tumult that had just erupted. The neatly trimmed hedges and blooming roses, so serene moments before, now framed a scene of high drama, as Leonard Hartley, his face ashen and his eyes wild, was restrained by Inspector Crane's officers. The small packet of white powder, retrieved from the grass after Emily's calculated stumble, lay in the inspector's gloved hand, a silent accusation that hung heavier than the scent of Earl Grey still lingering in the air. The guests, gathered for the memorial tea, stood frozen, their teacups forgotten, as they watched the unfolding spectacle. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender frock blending with the shadows of the willow tree, observed the scene with her characteristic calm, her knitting set aside, but her mind as sharp as ever. Inspector Roland Crane, his angular frame taut with authority, held up the packet for all to see, his mustache twitching with the weight of the moment. "Mr. Hartley," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade, "this powder will be tested, but I suspect we both know what it is. Aconite, identical to the poison that killed Mr. Langley. You were seen near the tea tray at the original party, and now this. Care to explain yourself before we take this further?" Leonard's composure, already frayed, shattered like the delicate porcelain of the teacups. His shoulders slumped, and a strangled sound escaped his throat as he struggled against the officer's grip. "It's not what you think," he cried, his voice rising with desperation. I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake." His eyes darted toward Mrs. Hartley, who stood near the tea table, her face pale, and her hands clutching her handkerchief as though it could anchor her against the storm. Miss Marple stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on Leonard with a gentleness that belied the steel beneath. "Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of certainty, "mistakes don't purchase aconite from a chemist or linger near a tea tray with such purpose, nor do they argue with a man about family matters just before he dies. The codicil, I believe, was the heart of it, wasn't it? You stood to lose a great deal, and Mr. Langley was in your way." The guests gasped, their whispers rising like a breeze through the roses. Mrs. Hartley's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mix of horror and realization. Leonard's face contorted, and for a moment it seemed he might deny everything. Then, with a sob that seemed to tear from his core, he collapsed onto a chair, his head in his hands. "I didn't want to kill him," he cried, his voice breaking. "I only wanted to stop him, to make him ill. just enough to delay the codicil. The estate, it was mine by right. Evelyn was going to give it all away to some charity, cutting me out entirely. Inspector Crane's eyes narrowed, and he signaled to his officers to tighten their hold. "Go on, Mr. Hartley," he said, his tone grim. "You've said enough to incriminate yourself. Tell us how you did it." Leonard's shoulders shook, and he looked up, his face a mask of anguish. "I knew Langley liked Earl Grey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I watched the servers, saw which pot was which. Emily, she showed me the blends before the party started, didn't suspect a thing. I slipped the aconite into one of the cups when no one was looking, just a pinch, I swear. I thought it would make him sick, not kill him. I didn't know it would act so fast." His voice rose, a plea for understanding that found no sympathy in the gathered crowd. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind piecing together the final details. "You chose a cup you knew would reach Mr. Langley," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "You used his preference for Earl Grey, and your moment near the tray gave you the opportunity. But aconite, Mr. Hartley, is not a substance one uses lightly. You purchased it from Mr. Pritchard, claiming it was for pests, but you knew its power. You meant to secure the inheritance, didn't you?" Leonard's head dropped, and a sob escaped him. "Yes," he whispered. "The codicil. It changed everything. My uncle promised me a share, years ago, before he died. I'd counted on it, planned for it. When Evelyn told me about the charity, I couldn't let it happen. Langley was going to finalize it, lock me out forever. I thought if he was out of the way, just for a little while, I could persuade her to reconsider." He looked up, his eyes pleading with Mrs. Hartley. "Evelyn, I didn't mean for it to go this far. You have to believe me." Mrs. Hartley's face was a study in grief and betrayal, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Leonard," she said, her voice trembling, "you were family. I trusted you. How could you do this?" She turned away, unable to meet his gaze, and Miss Marple saw the weight of her words settle over the garden like a pall. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his notebook open, his pencil scratching rapidly. "That's enough, Mr. Hartley," he said. "You've confessed to poisoning Mr. Langley with intent, whether you meant to kill him or not. You'll come with us to the station, and the courts will decide the rest." He nodded to his officers, who began to lead Leonard away, his protests fading into a defeated silence as they moved toward the manor's gate. The guests, their faces a mix of shock and fascination, began to disperse, their whispers already shaping the tale that would spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Mrs. Norton, her parasol forgotten, was already regaling a small group with her version of the events, her voice tinged with the thrill of vindication. Mr. Reed, his professional pride restored, stood by the tea table, his expression one of grim relief. Emily, the young server, hovered near the tray, her hands trembling, but her eyes bright with the knowledge that she had played a part in unmasking the truth. Miss Marple approached Mrs. Hartley, who stood alone by the rose trellis, her face turned toward the flowers, as though seeking solace in their beauty. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you've been through a terrible ordeal, but the truth is out now, and Mr. Langley's death will not go unpunished." Mrs. Hartley nodded, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I never imagined Leonard could. I should have seen it, shouldn't I? His questions, his restlessness. I thought it was just family curiosity." Her eyes filled, and she looked away, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch as soft as her voice. "We often see what we wish to see in those we care for," she said. "But you've done nothing wrong, my dear. The fault lies with Leonard, and he'll answer for it." As the inspector oversaw the final details, collecting the packet for analysis and taking Emily's statement, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. The garden, once a stage for elegance and tragedy, now felt like a place of closure, its roses bearing witness to both the crime and its resolution. She glanced at the tea table, the cups still gleaming in the fading light, and thought of the delicate balance of trust and betrayal that had played out here. Leonard's confession had confirmed her suspicions, but it was the trap, the carefully staged memorial tea, that had drawn him out, his nerves betraying him as she had hoped. Walking back to her cottage, the village settling into the quiet of evening, Miss Marple reflected 24. "You have a point about the randomness of the tea service, Miss Marple. Leonard knew Mr. Langley's preference and used it to his advantage, but your plan ensured he couldn't hide his guilt forever." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly in her mind. "Human nature, Mr. Hartley, is a predictable thing," she murmured to herself. "And in a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets are as fragile as porcelain." With the truth laid bare, she felt the familiar satisfaction of a puzzle solved, knowing that justice, like a well-brewed tea, required only patience to come to fruition. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and winding lanes, seemed to exhale as the news of Leonard Hartley's arrest spread like pollen on a summer breeze. The sun hung low, casting a golden sheen over the rooftops, but the air carried a lingering chill, as though the shadow of Mr. George Langley's murder still clung to the village's heart. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cozy parlor with a fresh pot of tea and her knitting, gazed out at her garden, where the last roses of the season bowed under the weight of evening dew. Her mind, however, was not on the flowers, but on the delicate threads of human nature that had unraveled at Rosewood Manor, revealing greed, betrayal, and ultimately, justice. The morning after the memorial tea, the village buzzed with a fervor that rivaled Mrs. Norton's most fervent gossip sessions. By mid-morning, the story of Leonard's confession, prompted by Miss Marple's cunning trap, had reached every corner of St. Mary Mead, from the butcher's shop to the vicarage. Mrs. Clara Norton, never one to miss an opportunity, held court at the village green, her parasol twirling, as she recounted the scene with embellishments that grew with each telling. "I saw it coming, of course," she declared to a rapt audience. "That Leonard, always skulking about, and Miss Marple, oh, she's a sharp one, setting that trap like a fox after a hare." Miss Marple, aware of the chatter but unmoved by it, focused her thoughts on the aftermath. She knew that a crime, once solved, left ripples that could unsettle even the most tranquil village. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, the hostess whose gracious facade had masked a deep unease, was foremost in her mind. The betrayal of a family member Miss Marple knew was a wound that cut deeper than any scandal, and she resolved to visit Rosewood Manor to offer what comfort she could. She donned her familiar lavender frock and straw hat, her knitting bag a constant companion, and set out along the familiar path to the manor. The village was alive with its usual rhythms, children playing near the duck pond, the baker's cart rattling by. But the glances cast her way were tinged with a new respect, as though the villagers sensed her quiet hand in the resolution of the tragedy. At the manor, the housemaid greeted her with a subdued curtsy, her eyes red-rimmed from the strain of recent events. "Mrs. Hartley's in the morning room, Miss Marple," she said. "She's not herself, but she'll be glad to see you." The morning room, with its tall windows and delicate furnishings, felt emptier than before, as though the grandeur of Rosewood Manor had been dimmed by the weight of betrayal. Mrs. Hartley sat by the fireplace, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her face pale but composed. She rose as Miss Marple entered, managing a faint smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but steady, "you've done more than I can ever repay. To think Leonard could. I still can't believe it." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting emerging with its familiar click. "My dear," she said, her tone warm with sympathy, "it's a terrible shock, I know. Family can wound us in ways we least expect, but you've shown great strength, and the truth is out now, thanks to your courage in hosting that second tea." Mrs. Hartley's eyes glistened, and she looked down at her hands, where the ring she had twisted so nervously still gleamed. "I should have suspected him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His questions about the estate, his insistence on staying at the cottage, I thought it was just family loyalty. But he was after the money, wasn't he? All because of that wretched codicil." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. "Greed, I'm afraid, can twist even the closest bonds," she said. "The codicil, as you said, excluded Leonard in favor of the charity your husband cherished. It was a motive too strong for him to resist, though he claimed he meant only to delay Mr. Langley, not to kill him." Mrs. Hartley's lips trembled, and she reached for the photograph on the mantel, the one behind which the codicil's draft had been hidden. "George was so careful," she said. "He wanted to ensure my husband's wishes were honored. I've sent the codicil to his firm now. It's finalized, and the charity will receive its due. But at what cost?" Her voice broke, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple rose and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You've done what's right, my dear," she said. "Your husband's legacy is secure, and Leonard's actions are his own burden, not yours. St. Mary Mead will heal, as villages do, and you'll find your strength again." Mrs. Hartley managed a nod, her gratitude unspoken but clear in her eyes. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she paused to glance at the photograph, now free of its hidden secret. The Hartley family, frozen in a happier time, seemed a poignant reminder of how quickly trust could fray. She left the manor with a quiet resolve, knowing that Mrs. Hartley would need time to mend, but also that the village's resilience would carry her through. Her next stop was the village hall, where Mr. Thomas Reed was overseeing the return of his catering equipment. The caterer, his starched apron a badge of his restored pride, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but warm, "I owe you thanks. That business with Leonard cleared my name and my staff's. I was beginning to think we'd never work again." "You did splendidly, Mr. Reed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "Your service was impeccable, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Young Emily, in particular, was a great help. She's a credit to you." Reed's face softened, and he nodded. "She's a good girl, though she was shaken. Said she felt something was off with Leonard from the start. I should have listened to her instincts." He paused, then added, "You've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. The village is lucky to have you." Miss Marple smiled, deflecting the praise with a wave of her hand. "I only notice what's there to be seen, Mr. Reed, and St. Mary Mead has a way of sorting itself out." She left him to his work, satisfied that his reputation, so fiercely defended, was now secure. As she passed the village green, she spotted Mrs. Norton, her parasol a bright spot against the fading light. The neighbor waved her over, her face alight with the thrill of the scandal. "Miss Marple," she called. "What a triumph! I always knew that Leonard was trouble. Didn't I say so? And you, setting that trap like a master." Her voice was loud enough to draw a few curious glances, but Miss Marple only smiled. "You did notice a great deal, Mrs. Norton," she said, her tone diplomatic. "Though I dare say you'll find new stories to tell soon enough. The village never stays quiet for long." She moved on before Mrs. Norton could press for more, knowing that the neighbors' appetite for gossip would soon find fresh fodder. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The codicil was finalized, Leonard was in custody, and the village was beginning to heal, yet she felt a quiet melancholy. Murder, she knew, left scars that lingered long after the culprit was caught. She thought of Langley, a man whose jovial exterior had masked his role as guardian of the Hartley legacy, and of Mrs. Hartley, whose trust in her cousin had been shattered. The tea party, with its delicate cups and deadly secrets, was a reminder of how fragile civility could be. As the fire crackled in her hearth, Miss Marple reflected on the power of observation. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where every glance and gesture held meaning, the truth was never far from the surface. Leonard's greed had been his undoing, but it was the quiet patience of a spinster's mind that had brought it to light. With a sigh, she picked up her needles, ready for whatever puzzle the village might next present, knowing that justice, like a well-tended garden, thrived on care and vigilance. Chapter 12. A Quiet Reflection. As the last days of summer faded over St. Mary Mead, the village settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and subtly altered, like a tapestry rewoven with a single thread pulled loose. The roses in Miss Jane Marple's garden drooped under the weight of autumn's approach, their petals curling at the edges. Yet their beauty held a quiet defiance against the changing season. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles moving with their customary grace, the soft click a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire in the hearth. A pot of tea steamed gently on the table, its aroma mingling with the scent of lavender from a bowl nearby. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, gazed out at the village, but her mind was on the events that had unfolded at Rosewood Manor, where a poisoned teacup had laid bare the frailties of human nature. The arrest of Leonard Hartley had brought closure to the tragedy, yet Miss Marple knew that closure was a fragile thing, easily disturbed by the ripples of memory and regret. The village, ever resilient, was returning to its routines. Market days, church teas, the gentle hum of gossip. But the story of the poisoned tea party lingered, a cautionary tale whispered in parlors and over garden fences. Mrs. Clara Norton, predictably, had spun the tale into a saga, her accounts growing more dramatic with each retelling, though Miss Marple noted with amusement that the neighbor now credited herself with suspecting Leonard from the start. Mr. Thomas Reed, his reputation restored, was already planning his next event, his pride undimmed by the ordeal. And Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, though still shadowed by betrayal, had begun to reclaim her role as the manor's gracious hostess, her strength a testament to the village's enduring spirit. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to George Langley, the jovial barrister whose laughter had once echoed through the garden, now silenced by a cousin's greed. She pictured him standing by the rose trellis, his teacup in hand, unaware of the deadly intent hidden in its delicate porcelain. His role as keeper of the Hartley estate's secrets had made him a target, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sorrow for a man caught in the crosshairs of another's ambition. Yet she also felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her careful observation, the vial in the flower bed, the codicil behind the photograph, the nervous glances of a young server, had brought justice to his memory. She sipped her tea, its warmth a comfort against the evening chill, and reflected on the codicil that had sparked the tragedy. Finalized now, it ensured that the Hartley estate would support a charity dear to Mrs. Hartley's late husband, a legacy of generosity that Leonard's actions had sought to undo. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Hartley's trembling hands, her voice breaking as she spoke of her cousin's betrayal, and hoped that time would mend the wounds left by such a breach of trust. Families, she knew, were fragile things, their bonds tested by the weight of expectation and the lure of wealth. The village clock chimed softly, its notes drifting through the open window, and Miss Marple's mind wandered to the broader canvas of St. Mary Mead. It was a place of quiet beauty, where the surface calm belied the currents of human drama that ran beneath. She had seen such dramas before: jealousies, rivalries, secrets hidden behind polite smiles, and she knew she would see them again. Yet each time, she found solace in the act of unraveling them, of finding the truth in the small details that others overlooked. A glance, a hesitation, a misplaced vial. These were the threads that, when pulled, revealed the heart of a mystery. Her needles paused as she considered Leonard Hartley, now awaiting trial in a cell far from the manor's elegance. His confession, wrung from him by the pressure of the memorial tea, had been a study in human weakness. Greed, Miss Marple mused, was a poison as deadly as aconite, clouding judgment and eroding loyalty. Leonard had seen the estate as his due, a promise from a past that no longer held sway, and his desperation had led him to a crime he claimed he never intended to be fatal. Yet intent, she knew, was a poor defense against the finality of death. She rose to tend the fire, adding a log that sent sparks dancing up the chimney, and her thoughts turned to the village itself. St. Mary Mead was a microcosm of the world, its inhabitants no less complex for their small stage. Mrs. Norton, with her insatiable curiosity, would find new tales to tell, her gossip a mirror to the village's pulse. Mr. Reed, his craft vindicated, would continue to serve teas and scones, his meticulous nature a bulwark against chaos. And Mrs. Hartley, though scarred, would carry on, her manner a beacon of grace in a world that could be unkind. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm as the fire cast a warm glow across the room. She thought of the tea party, its elegance shattered by a single act of malice, and of the delicate balance between civility and deceit. In St. Mary Mead, where every rose had its thorn, the truth was a flower that bloomed only for those who tended it with care. She had tended this one, with her quiet questions and patient observation, And though the task was done, she knew the village would soon offer another. As the stars began to prick the sky, visible through her window, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and poured another cup of tea. The poisoned tea party was over, its secrets laid bare, but the village, like her garden, would continue to grow, its stories unfolding with each new season. With a contented sigh, she lifted her cup, ready for whatever puzzle St. Mary Mead might next present, knowing that truth, like a well-brewed tea, required only time and care to reveal its full flavor.